age-old story of the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, as told by Juniper, of the wandering herd of Micah, the shepherd of Bethlehem. Once upon a time, an extraordinary thing happened. Watch the sheep, not me. My friends and I were out in the fields, having a lovely sleep after a rough day. Micah, our shepherd, was sitting nearby, keeping a watchful eye. He did this for a couple of reasons. The first was for our safety, to be sure that any predators didn't infiltrate our flock and cause us harm. The second reason was because some of us were prone to insomnia and would wander off in search of amusement or even some harmless mischief. You can't blame a sheep for wanting to escape boredom, and you can't blame Micah either for wanting to limit trouble. But I digress. We were sleeping when suddenly there was a loud noise, like 40 thunderstorms being unleashed all at the same time. But it wasn't a rumbling storm, it was a symphony of music and the voices of angels. You might wonder how a sheep knows about music and the voices of angels. I can tell you this. We've witnessed all kinds of things over the years, and we're pretty good storytellers. Passing stories down from one generation to the next. Some of us are even good comedians and mimics. Some nights around the fire, the stories get long and colorful. So do the songs. But I digress. On this night, the music and the angels got Micah up on his feet in a heartbeat. He heard them say something about a baby being born, a baby who would save the world. He got into a bit of conversation with one of the angels about that, seeing how it struck all of us as a tall tale. Remember that we're a flock of storytellers and tall tales. But then Norris, one of the more impulsive sheep in the flock, decided that he wanted to go check out the claim of the angel for himself, and off he ran. Micah, of course, ran after him, and once Micah took off, the rest of us didn't want to be left behind. So we all followed suit. That was a sight, let me tell you. Norris is pretty fast for a small sheep, and he set quite the pace. Now here's another remarkable thing. It was the middle of the night, but the sky was bright as blazes because there was this big old star riding low in the sky. It lit up the hills so that we could see where we were going and avoid any cliffs and water holes. You have to watch out for those water holes. We're grateful for places to drink and keep hydrated, but sheep aren't the best swimmers in the world. We've lost more than a few of the flock when they thought it would be a good idea to boast about how brave and clever they were. And the next thing you know, but I digress. Before you knew it, we had arrived at a house on the edge of Bethlehem. The place was teeming with people. I overheard someone say something about a census, and that family members had come into town from the outer farms and villages so that they could be counted. I know something about counting. People count sheep all the time, which is fine if we're sleeping and not moving. But if we're hungry and grazing at full speed, it can be hard to keep track of which of us is where. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard exasperation in someone's voice when they said, "Oh, for crying out loud, they won't stay still and I have to start counting all over again." Here's the funny thing. If someone is counting sheep because they can't sleep, you'd think that any distraction would be helpful to pass the time as they begin to get tired. But I digress. That big, bright star seemed to be hovering over this house full of people. Norris, who had gotten ahead of us, came out of the house quite full of himself. Just as the angel said, he reported, "There's a baby inside." Funny thing, he looks like just any old baby. I don't see what all the fuss is about. I had my eye on Micah, who was standing at the edge of the doorway looking in. The light from inside illuminated his face, which was glowing with a kind of awe. I moved closer and got next to him, peering around his leg. There along the wall was a big fat pillow with a young woman named Mary leaning up against it, holding a baby. A man was standing beside her. "Joseph," I heard her say, surveying the room in a kind of protective posture. There was a doorway from this outer room into the house, and the hum of conversation slipped through, offering a kind of comforting, harmonic drone. Every now and then someone called out to another person across the house, interrupting. Oops, the page didn't print. Tranquility. Interrupting tranquility. But there was, nonetheless, a peaceful quality about the scene before me. Norris was right. This looked like any old baby. Then he scrunched up his face and let out a wail that filled the room, and then some. Then, just like that, he settled down and was still. Joseph made a chuckle. "He may have just entered the world, but it's clear Jesus has got something to say," he said. Mary smiled, reaching up to squeeze his hand, then placed the back of her hand to Jesus' cheek ever so gently. He let out a long, deep sigh, then he scrunched up his face again and released a sneeze. Phew! It was a startlingly provocative sneeze, one I can't mimic, and I found myself straining for a better view. Just then, I noticed Mary shiver a bit and pull a blanket up around her and Jesus against a chill I hadn't noticed. Well, why would I notice? I'm covered in wool, and cold isn't really something that affects me. But I'm very much aware that people get cold and that they covet the wool that grows on our bodies. It's amazing the things that are created from our wool. Blankets and clothing and drapes for doorways and windows against a winter night or an early spring frost. And I've seen all sorts of interesting colors applied to it, even though most people use the wool in its natural state. There are some talented artisans in the world creating beauty from our wool. But I digress. As if on cue, when Jesus sneezed, several sheep from our flock moved into the room and snuggled up against Mary and the baby. It was really very sweet how they were so concerned about keeping them warm. Norris found his way into the mix. That's the dark one, Norris. Can you bring Norris to Mary? There you go. Thank you. Norris likes to be in the middle of everything. And Jesus reached out his hand and caught his fingers in the curly wool of Norris's neck. A coo escaped Jesus' lips, and Norris beamed. I think he was beginning to change his tune. I must say that we were all quite mesmerized. This little fellow did look like any other baby, and yet there was a presence about him that commanded the room. Joseph pulled a bowl from a nearby table that held some figs. He offered some to Mary, who took one gratefully and put it to her lips. Jesus sighed again, and though it was the sigh of an infant, I heard within it the melody of the angels and the song of the earth. It was as though in this child God had composed the finest of symphonies, the rhythm of which was grace and love. Norris leaned in a little closer, and if I'm not mistaken, the tug of a smile spread across the wee one's small face. In that small gesture, I detected evidence of a shift in the universe. Mary then passed the child into Joseph's comforting arms. As the infant settled into the crook of Joseph's elbow, I could see the fullness of Jesus' face, which radiated a peaceful, divine glow. Joseph's smile reflected that glow back into the room, which seemed suddenly full of light. Perhaps the angel was right after all. Perhaps the presence of love, so palpable in the space where we were gathered, would emanate from these gentle hearts into the chaotic world in which we lived and change the course of humanity. Perhaps the plight of the lost, like members of my own flock, would find a shepherd whose embrace would encircle all who needed comfort and healing. Jesus yawned, and it seems to be the case with human beings. The contagion of this act was caught by Mary, and in turn by Joseph. Their half-closed eyes betrayed their need for sleep, and I could see Joseph begin to assess how best to arrange the pillows and straw to make a comfortable bed for his family. I was loath to leave the warmth of this place and the divinity that was permeating even my thick wool. The heavenly host had already departed to go elsewhere to share the good news of what had taken place and to alert the world to the grace that had come into it. Micah, too, seemed ready to move on, eager to tell the other shepherds what he had witnessed and to share with them the miracle that had unfolded at the doorstep of their world. I didn't want to lose sight of the path he took back to the fields. Even in the bathing light of the star overhead, it could be tricky to find footing on the hills, and it wouldn't do to stumble and get stranded by my own clumsiness. I could tell you a story or two about times when that has happened to me before, and how I wanted to avoid a repeat of such an adventure. But I digress.